A dreary, desolate shore, swept by winds and waves, seemingly abandoned by nature itself. That was how some early European visitors described the southern tip of Africa, bleak, barren and forbidding. But in 1652, the Dutch East India Company, they saw something very different: opportunity. And the leader of their momentous expedition, Jan van Riebeeck, looked upon this strange and distant shore not with fear, but with faith. In his journal he wrote, "Today, God be praised, we safely arrived at this cape. The land is rich and fertile, with fine valleys and streams." To him, it was a blessing, a beginning, a sign. Hello, I'm Dr. Philip, and this is the Lost History Files. The birth of any nation is easily idealised, and South Africa is no exception. In 1952, the National Party used the tercentenary of Van Riebeeck's arrival as a tool for propaganda. But in striving for truth and reconciliation today, there's another risk. The risk of erasing or downplaying the stories, the history, yes, even the myths of any group within a society, including the Europeans. Today we explore how a handful of Dutch settlers, led by Jan van Riebeeck and his wife Maria, came ashore at the Cape, and how their arrival set in motion centuries of transformation, conflict and change. Why did the Dutch come? What were they seeking? And how did their arrival reshape the destiny of a land and its people? Stay with me as we open the Lost History File on 1652, the Dutch arrival at the Cape. In the middle of the 17th century, the world was being stitched together by ships, wooden hulls, battered sails and stubborn men, moving goods, gold and empires across vast oceans. At the centre of this dangerous, ever-tightening web stood a single name, the VOC. The initials stood for Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the Dutch East India Company, the greatest trading empire the world had ever seen. It wasn't just a company, it was a floating nation. Founded in 1602 under charter from the States General, the government of the Dutch Republic, the VOC had, by mid-century, become the dominant European maritime power in Southeast Asia. Its reach was astonishing. A fleet of nearly 6,000 ships totalling 600,000 tons, more than 50,000 sailors under its command. And its powers were nearly sovereign. It minted its own coins, commanded armies, made laws, waged wars. VOC ships sailed west from the cold harbours of Amsterdam and Rotterdam, south through the wild Atlantic, around the treacherous Cape of Good Hope, and east into the warm, contested waters of the Indian Ocean. Their destination? The Spice Islands, or Batavia, in what is now Indonesia. There, luxuries like nutmeg, cloves and pepper grew in abundance and promised riches beyond imagination. But the journey was brutal. Ships could be lost to storms, scurvy, pirates, or simply the relentless exhaustion of the sea. And at the halfway point of this perilous voyage, every ship faced one fateful landmark, the Cape of Good Hope. To European sailors it was both a promise and a curse. The Cape offered a chance to stop, repair their vessels, gather fresh water and barter for cattle. But it was wild country. No European port, no safety, no supply station. Just endless hills, shifting winds, and the native Khoikhoi people, with whom relations were uncertain at best. If the VOC was to dominate the spice trade, to control the arteries of empire, it needed more than passing winds and blind luck. It needed an anchor, a foothold, a lifeline for its ships, and the Dutch knew all too well the dangers of the Cape coastline. Shortly after 5 p.m. on March the 25th, 1647, the sea whispered its secrets. A Dutch East Indiaman's ship, the New Haarlem, foundered. Its hull shattered on the rocks. Cast adrift by fate, the shipwrecked sailors didn't just fight for survival. They found something else. A future. Their struggle lit the path for the Dutch East India Company's grand design. In the broken timbers of a lost ship, the VOC glimpsed opportunity, a freshwater haven, a staging post carved between mountain and sea. The Cape was not discovered with flags and fanfare. It was won, first, by desperate hands hauling wreckage ashore, daring to live where none, at least no European, had yet claimed dominion. And so, in 1652, the Dutch decided to act. They would build something that had never existed there before, a permanent European colony at the southern tip of Africa. One that would feed their ships, guard their fortunes, and, unknowingly, plant the seeds for centuries of conflict. The VOC, intent on securing a foothold, sent a man to shape the future of the Cape, Jan van Riebeeck, who, on the 14th of December 1651, left Amsterdam aboard the VOC vessel Dromedaris. On the evening of the 6th of April 1652, van Riebeeck, together with his small fleet of 5 ships, sailed not just into Table Bay on the Cape, but into history. A man of ambition, vision, and perhaps blind determination. And today a man whose contested legacy inevitably sparks fierce debate. His task? To establish a station that could service the VOC's ships en route to and from Batavia, a place to refresh, repair and resupply. They brought with them everything they believed they'd need. Men, supplies, plans. But there was one thing they could not bring with them, the land itself. The Cape was untamed, the soil unfamiliar, the air thick with the unknown. For the Dutch it was both a chance and a threat. The first task was to build, and so they turned to timber, toil and trust in their own survival. The first structure they raised was not a church nor a home, but a fort. The Fort to Good Hope, to shield their fragile colony. A structure that still stands today as the oldest surviving building in South Africa. There were no masons, no blueprints, just hastily dug trenches, timber from the surrounding forests, and a grim understanding. If they failed to build, they would die. The fort at first was little more than a clay and timber redoubt, angular, simple, functional. Its walls rose from the soil like a defiant promise, packed with sod and reinforced with wooden palisades. 4 corners, a moat, a gateway that faced the uncertain world beyond. The flag of the Dutch Republic was proudly hoisted high on the keep and saluted by incoming ships. Inside, barrels, gunpowder, food stores and the rattling faith of a dozen men who slept beside their muskets. This was not a fortress in the grand European style. It was a survival box, a signal to the world and to the Khoikhoi that the Dutch were not passing through, they were staying. They also began clearing ground for the first European-style gardens. But these gardens were not just about growing fresh produce to supply Dutch shipping. They were about survival. They were the tools of empire, the first step in claiming permanence. The Dutch East India Company had planted its flag in African soil. From that moment, the Cape would become a crossroads, where Europe, Asia and Africa converged. The power of the VOC wove itself into the land, and the land pushed back. Van Riebeeck envisioned a garden, What he built was a garrison, because it wasn't just a settlement, it was a foothold in a war zone. Just weeks after the Dutch arrived, the Republic was at war with a former ally, the First Anglo-Dutch War, a bitter naval struggle over trade routes, empire and control of the seas. English privateers hunted Dutch merchantmen. The VOC began arming its ships, and that little station at the Cape of Good Hope, well, it was suddenly no longer a quiet outpost. It was a strategic prize. True, there was no battle off Cape Town shores, not yet, but the threat was real. Walls rose, muskets stood ready, eyes scanned the sea. The colony had barely begun, and already it was bracing for war. Cape Town wasn't founded in peace. It was born in the age of empire, with cannon smoke on the wind. Yet there was another force, more immediate and far harder to control. The people who were already there. Long before the Dutch ships arrived, the Cape had been home to its first stewards, the Khoikhoi. For centuries this proud tribe had roamed southern Africa, their cattle, kinship and culture bound deeply to the land. They were not passive inhabitants, they resisted. When early Portuguese sailors tried to land or trade, the Khoikhoi pushed back. Clashes turned violent, and with no gold, no spices, no quick fortunes to tempt them, the Portuguese soon looked elsewhere. But the Dutch stayed. As they carved out their presence in Table Bay, clearing land for gardens, driving posts into the earth, raising their fort, the Khoikhoi watched closely. In their eyes this was interference. There was no immediate bloodshed. At first there was even trade, albeit cautious, transactional, but peaceable enough. But tension simmered. The Khoikhoi had no interest in submission, not to foreign merchants, not to armed newcomers. Their cattle, their grazing lands, their very way of life, all were now under threat. Van Riebeeck's stance was blunt. Cooperate with us and we shall trade with you. Resist us and we will be forced to fight. And so, as the Dutch laid the foundations of what would become South Africa's earliest permanent European settlement, the first lines of conflict were already being written. The collision was coming. The history of the Cape would not just be about spice routes. It would be about resistance, it would be about conflict. By 1653, just a year after landing, Jan van Riebeeck was beginning to understand. The new world he had imagined was far from assured. His vision, not merely a refreshment station but a flourishing European outpost, was already straining under the weight of reality. Yes, the Dutch East India Company had begun its work. Ships were re-victualled, trade routes stayed open, the settlement had taken root. But a question loomed. Would the Cape become a place of survival or of unrelenting struggle? Struggle not only against imperial enemies or native resistance, but against the land itself. The Cape was fertile in places, yes, but it was no tame garden. It did not yield easily. Van Riebeeck's dream of a thriving colony was about to collide with the brutal facts of life at the foot of Africa. Disease, starvation, endless discomfort. In the first year alone, the settlers suffered bitterly. Disease crept through the camp like a ghost, striking silently. Men died before they had raised proper homes, some before they'd even raised walls. This was not the orderly beginning of a colony, it was survival, inch by inch. Scurvy, the sailor's curse, began to take hold, caused by a lack of fresh fruit and vegetables. It spread like rot. The settlers had spent months at sea. Their bodies were worn, immune systems wrecked. Now on land, they were too weak to fight what came next. One settler wrote in his journal, "The men began to fall ill one by one. Scurvy took them, hollowing them out like ghosts. By the end of the month, nearly a third of the crew could not rise from their beds. We prayed the winds would change, that the ships would come soon with fresh provisions, but they did not." But disease was only the beginning. Hunger followed. Van Riebeeck, desperate to feed his men, ordered the planting of gardens, neat European-style plots carved into unfamiliar African soil. But the land did not welcome them. The crops came all too slowly. The soil, thick and stubborn, resisted the plough. The climate, unfamiliar and unforgiving. Long dry spells, sudden violent rain, seasons that made no sense to Dutch calendars. The Cape was not a garden, it was a gauntlet. Long arid summers baked the ground. Then winter came, bringing rains in violent torrents, washing away what little had begun to grow. Another settler recorded the struggle. "We've planted and replanted, but the earth does not yield as it should. The rains are too much, and then the sun too little. My hands are raw from the earth, but the harvest remains distant, like a dream." This was no paradise. The winds cut like knives, the sun scorched, the rain soaked them to the bone. What was meant to be a haven had become a crucible. And all the while, the Khoikhoi watched. Then, in December 1652, the Cape turned on them mercilessly. A storm descended, brutal, punishing, tearing through the half-built fort, flooding the fragile gardens and nearly destroying the docked ships, their only lifeline to the outside world. One account described the chaos. The wind howled like a wild beast, and we feared for our lives as the fort creaked and groaned. The crops we had so carefully planted washed away. All we could do was wait for the storm to pass, hoping our hopes hadn't drowned with the flood. But through it all, the settlers endured. Through disease, through hunger, through the howling storms and rising tensions. They held the line. They had one thing left: determination. They would not turn back. The Cape had proven itself a place of constant challenges. But in the face of adversity, the settlers began to understand the most crucial lesson of all. Survival here was not just about planting gardens, building forts, or securing trade routes. It was about outlasting the land itself. Outlasting its climate, outlasting its diseases, and outlasting the forces that fought to keep them out. It didn't all hinge on Jan van Riebeeck. While his name often looms largest in the history of the Cape Colony, his wife Maria van Riebeeck, the quiet force behind the scenes, also left an indelible mark on the settlement. As the First Lady of the Cape, Maria's role was far more than a traditional homemaker's. She was the steady pulse that helped give life to the fledgling colony. In those early, fragile days, when survival itself seemed uncertain, it was Maria who helped weave together the social and domestic fabric of a community that was at times bound by little more than sheer will. In a land where the winds howled with the threats of disease, hunger and isolation, her care and determination created a semblance of home, a place of refuge, stability and hope amidst the harshest of circumstances. But her impact was not confined to the hearth. As tensions simmered between the settlers and the Khoikhoi people, Maria became a figure of diplomacy and grace, quietly setting the tone for peaceful interaction. She didn't just manage the household, she nurtured the very soul of the colony, helping to build bridges where conflict could easily have torn them apart. While Jan van Riebeeck focused on securing the colony's economic and strategic foothold, Maria understood that survival at the Cape wasn't just about conquering the land. It was about fostering a society that could thrive in the face of adversity. Through her, the Cape became more than a mere outpost of empire. It became a place where people could, against all odds, find belonging. Mind you, domestic harmony wasn't always this couple's strong suit. In A Letter Home, a rather henpecked Jan nostalgically recalled those carefree Batavia days when Maria went off to Europe on her shopping trips. As the days wore on at the Cape, the Dutch settlers, once little more than pawns in the vast machinery of the Dutch East India Company, began to change in ways that no one had expected. They had endured the worst of scurvy, storms that howled like beasts, and the crushing weight of hunger. But now something deeper stirred within them, a quiet, unspoken shift. The harsh land, with its dry, unyielding earth and volatile seasons, had forced them to adapt, not just to survive, but to become part of it. The settlers began to change, not merely in body, but in spirit. Their dependence on the company faded, and in its place, a different sense of self began to take root. They had come to the Cape as servants of empire. Now they were becoming something more. By the late 1650s, the once narrow boundaries of Cape Town no longer seemed sufficient. The men, first Dutch, then Germans, Huguenots and others, began to venture out, drawn by the promise of land that was both hostile and seductive. They moved into the hills, across vast open plains, carving out farms and isolated settlements, where their own sweat and labour would determine their future. These were the Vryburgers, free citizens, once bound to the VOC, now striking out on their own. Expansion was slow but steady, and by the time Jan van Riebeeck left the Cape in 1662, the colony's population stood at 35 free burghers, 134 company officials, 180 enslaved people, most of them from Angola, along with just 15 women and 22 children. These early free burghers, mostly petty officers with families, were not simply men who had stayed long enough to retire. They were pioneers, daring to shape a life for themselves in this wild, unpredictable land. Most were married Dutch citizens, bound to the soil by a commitment to spend no fewer than 20 years in Africa. The VOC, eager to ensure their survival, granted them plots of land, 13.5 morgen, roughly 7 acres, along with a 12-year exemption from taxes and loans for seeds and tools. But these provisions, meagre as they might have seemed, represented something far more profound than just material wealth. They were the first promises of autonomy. The Vryburgers worked the land with raw hands and stubborn resolve, driven by the relentless will to forge a new future. It wasn't just about farming. It was about claiming a place for themselves in a world that had, until now, been indifferent to their existence. With every furrow ploughed, every seed sown, they were not just growing crops, they were planting the roots of a new identity. A settler identity, hard, self-reliant, shaped by the land's unforgiving demands. The old ways of life, those of imperial administrators and city merchants, began to fade into memory. The settlers were no longer mere cogs in the wheel of the Dutch East India Company. No, they were becoming something else, something born of this vast, untamed land. Soon they would be known by a new name, the Boers. The Boers were farmers, not just landholders, but pioneers, pushing into the unknown, shaping the land as much as it shaped them. Their language too began to shift, from Dutch to something new, something uniquely their own, Afrikaans, a dialect born from necessity, shaped by the daily struggle for survival, woven together by the influences of Malay, Khoikhoi, German, Portuguese and French. It was a tongue born of the land and the people who learned to navigate it, adapt to it, and eventually thrive on it. One settler wrote, his words sharp with defiance, "The land has become our master. The soil is stubborn, but it is ours. Yet the company's demands grow ever heavier. Our hearts no longer turn to the ships in the bay, but to the distant hills beyond. We are no longer its servants. We are becoming the lords of this land." Stirring stuff. But while the settlers saw themselves as lords, the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, still held the reins. It regulated nearly every aspect of life, what they could grow, sell, trade, even where they could trade it. Every move came with rules, levies and paperwork in triplicate. The VOC wasn't a government, it was a business, and like any business, it cared more about profits than pioneers. Tensions simmered. The first stirrings of an exodus began to take shape. This was the beginning of the Boer Trek, a slow withdrawal from the company's grasp, fueled by a longing for land, freedom, and perhaps just a little peace and quiet. The Boers turned inland. From freeburgers to trek Boers, they were no longer just settlers. They were becoming something new, something independent. As the Boers left the coastal plains behind, they encountered the Khoikhoi once more, but this time in greater numbers. The settlers, who had long grown accustomed to seeing the land as theirs to claim, were now pressing into territories inhabited for centuries by others. And these people, who had once watched their movements from a distance, now observed them with wary eyes. One settler wrote, "The native tribes watch us with suspicion as we push further into their lands. They are not our friends, nor will they ever be. Our only hope lies in securing our place in this wilderness, and that we know will take strength." As the Boers pushed deeper into the heart of South Africa, the winds of conflict began to stir. What was once a relationship built on trade, cattle for goods, barter for survival, began to sour. With each step inland, the Boers stopped seeing the Khoikhoi as trading partners. No longer was the land viewed as shared space for mutual benefit. Now it had become a battleground. To the Boers, land was no longer just a necessity, it was ownership, something they believed was rightfully theirs to claim. The Khoikhoi, once a distant presence, were now becoming a symbol of resistance, an obstacle that stood between the Boers and their vision of the land. And in this shift, something darker began to take root. The Boers, who had once been defined by their isolation and self-reliance, were growing more aggressive. Their sense of entitlement, born from their struggle to survive, had evolved into something more dangerous. It was no longer just about surviving the land. It was about conquering it. The vast, unforgiving veldt, so indifferent to their survival, now fed their hunger, not just for space, but for power. As the conflict with the Khoikhoi deepened, their frustrations also began to turn inward. Their disillusionment with the Dutch East India Company reached a boiling point, and the company was not blind to the unfolding situation. Even in the 1650s, VOC officials were already feeling the early tremors of what looked suspiciously like independence, and they didn't like it. A 1657 diary entry from Jan van Riebeeck grumbles, "These people, whom we entrusted with the land, now believe they are above our laws. Their defiance, their insistence on farming as they please, and their blatant disregard for our restrictions all speak to a dangerous spirit of rebellion." And this from a VOC report 2 years later. The Boers, though initially granted lands, seem increasingly disinclined to comply with our regulations. They push back further from our reach, establishing their own laws and customs as they see fit. The Boers' defiance was no longer a quiet murmur. It had acquired volume and confidence. Their trek inland wasn't just about finding fertile ground. It was also a not-so-subtle way of saying, "We've had enough of the forms and the red tape." This was a challenge, not only to the indigenous communities they encountered, but to Dutch authority itself. As the trek Boers drifted ever further from Cape Town, wagons creaking, livestock trailing, the VOC began to realise these farmers weren't just growing crops, they were growing ideas, unruly, self-governing, and increasingly out of reach. In this vast, unforgiving land, the Boers forged a character that would resonate through South African history, a spirit that defied control, resisted authority, and remembered even generations later in the Boer War how their ancestors had once stood up to the mighty VOC. One settler, writing in his journal around 1670, captured the mood amongst the free burghers. "We came to build something of our own. The company speaks of laws and boundaries, but they know nothing of this land. They sit behind walls in Cape Town, while we break our backs on the soil. It is we who fend off the beasts, who bury our children in dry ground, who trade with the tribes when the company offers us nothing but debt and orders. We do not need their permission to live. The veldt calls to us, and beyond it, freedom." This was no mere grumbling. It was the beginning of a rupture. The Boers were no longer content to be subjects. They were becoming something else: landowners, survivors, and slowly, rebels. So there was nuance in the establishment of the Cape. In 1652, the settlers were all part of a single Dutch colonial venture, but distinctions soon emerged. Over time, a divide opened between the urban, Cape-based Dutch and the more rugged, independent Boer farmers of the interior. Others came too, refugees from persecution like the Huguenots, but their arrival was more than a peaceful migration. It marked a cultural shift that would echo far beyond the Cape and influence the long story of Boer defiance. When the first rough houses rose at the Cape of Good Hope, no one could have imagined they were laying the first stones of a future nation. And yet, from that tiny colony grew a people who would, centuries later, stand and defy an empire, the British Empire.